Welcome to this exclusive step-by-step watercolour tutorial of an old barn with daisies in the foreground. And I'd just like to say a big thank you to Karen from my Patreon membership for inspiring this tutorial. Karen gave lots of suggestions, one of them being a collapsed old barn in a field of wildflowers on my recent Patreon poll, and thank you to everyone else for your wonderful suggestions as well. I saw this photograph and I thought this would be a great sort of barn to create textures, etc. And the daisies came sort of from my imagination. So I really hope you're going to enjoy this tutorial. Let's get started. You can find the sketch outline below the description, just above the comments. So for my first step, I drew the barn, the old barn, with an HB pencil. And I'm going to mask out the light areas with masking fluid. So this is just a preparation stage, and also to decide on the colours, and I'll talk more about that later. As you saw there, I just covered my paintbrush, it's an old paintbrush, with hand liquid soap, and I'm masking out the sort of white edges at the top of the barn. And this is really just to bring it forward away from the dark trees. I just like to have a little bit of masking fluid here and there to protect the light areas. You don't have to do this, it's just part of my process almost. And I'm spattering the masking fluid here and there as well, using this old synthetic brush. I am masking out some of the daisies here. I'm actually making them quite big right in the foreground, and then I'll make them slightly smaller as they sort of go towards that old barn. Again, you can choose your own flowers, your own wildflowers. They don't have to be daisies. Remember, this is straight from my imagination, but I thought it'd be quite nice to create depth in the painting and also light and details as well. And of course, I love daisies. I'm using cold press paper. It is 9 by 12 inches, and I've actually put some washi tape around the border. I just find it's quite kind to watercolour paper, but you can use masking tape or framing tape. You don't need to use the tape, only if you're actually taping down your painting to a board, but I'm using a watercolour block, so I don't actually need to use this tape. However, I do like to have a white border at the end of my painting. It just gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more. Plus, if I don't actually frame this picture, I can store it in a portfolio, and I just like the white edge because it almost just sort of frames it quite nicely as well and presents your work really well. So I'm just making a few more marks here and there with the masking fluid, with the daisies. So they're kind of sort of side angles. They're not sort of with the centres showing. And I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry naturally. In step 2, I'm going to paint light and mid greens, wet into wet and damp into damp on the foliage area and grasses, and I'm also going to use some Brusho and salt to create light and textures and details. So I am mixing the colours, I'm getting them prepared for the background. So a big puddle, 2 big puddles here of cadmium yellow, quite a milky wash, and then I'm adding some cerulean to the cadmium yellow in the middle here, so you get a very light yellow green here. I'm using my size 8 brush to mix with. I would suggest, if you are colour mixing and using pans, to use an old brush to mix with, because you can actually wear out the points of your good brushes, so use an older brush. I added some cobalt teal to the yellow on the right and some phthalo blue to the yellow on the left there. So I've got lots of yummy greens, a mid and 2 lighter greens, one more yellow than the other. And I'm using my 1-inch flat soft head brush to wet all of the painting except the barn. So just paint around everything and take your time doing this. Allow the water to soak into the paper for, even spend a few minutes doing this, because what happens is the sort of membranes of the paper will be really nice and damp, and the surface will be as well, and it just gives you more time to paint. Sometimes when you just wet the paper for, 30 seconds, it dries so quickly, so spend a bit of time doing this. So I'm using that flat 1-inch brush just to start off with the yellow. I'm putting it in the lightest areas, which is sort of the sky area directly above the barn. So it's almost like a focal point there of light. I'm just working around that yellow now, painting carefully around the barn, and the paint won't sort of drift onto the barn because it's dry. So I'm actually using a little bit of the lighter greens now, the yellow green and the mid green in the foreground. This is all wet in wet. Have fun with it. You can't really go wrong with it, and also leave some little white gaps, especially at the sort of centre at the top there where the sort of sun's coming through the sky where it's lightest. You've always got to think about the light in your painting. It's the most important thing. And it's a thing that we can lose so easily, especially overworking. So remember, less is more. So I'm actually applying that sort of mid-green, wet into wet, just around the sort of left and right at the top there. And this will all blend and mix together as well because it's all wet in wet. And what you get with wet and wet is obviously you can mix the colours there, but you get lovely soft edges as well. So I'm building up these layers, working light to dark. So I'm now going to work damp into damp. If you look at the surface of the paper, the sheen is still there, but it's not as wet. I'm mixing up thick, creamy colour using phthalo blue, yellow, cadmium yellow, and burnt sienna, just to make it a little bit warmer. You notice there straight away the paint isn't running as much because it's damp. I'm using my size 10 round brush to apply these mid-tones. What happens is when you paint on a wet surface, you'll get soft edges. Because it's damp, it doesn't run as much, so it kind of stays put, but you get these lovely soft edges. So you've got a little bit more definition with damp into damp, but the paint gets diluted a little bit, so it's not as dark as what it is in the palette. And you've almost got to think about that when you're actually mixing the colours. So make them a little bit darker because they will get diluted. So I'm tilting here to get the colours to move and to blend. So I'm just softening with a clean damp brush the hard edge just in front of the barn there, so you don't get a hard edge there. I'm mixing up some Paynes grey, phthalo blue and burnt sienna. Quite thick and creamy. It's a very, very dark green, and I'm painting damp into damp. And you can see the paint just stays there. It doesn't move too much, but it's lovely. It's a lovely dark green. If you look at the photograph, there's a lot of dark green, but remember your light is important. So you almost have to exaggerate the light. So I'm working my way around the right hand side and in front of that barn there. We've got lots of dark sort of bushes, etc., going up into this sort of trees on the left hand side. It's a really nice way of painting the foliage. I'm going to add a pinch of quinacridone gold to that green just to make it slightly lighter here. And I'm rinsing my brush now, and I'm going to use a little bit more of that lighter green just as it goes up towards the centre area here. I don't want to lose my light areas, so I'm making it slightly lighter there behind the left hand roof there of the barn. And I'm adding a touch more dark, damp into damp here. I've added a pinch more burnt sienna as well. Remember to mix up your colours beforehand, it will give you more time. I'm just tilting my painting now upside down to get the colours to blend and mix, but also to create some lovely atmospheric effects. And I'm using the spritzer bottle where the paint was a little bit too thick and it wasn't moving, so it's blended it, as you can see, quite nicely here. And I'm adding a little bit more dark to the foreground area. One is it will create depth because stronger, darker tonal values come forward, but also I want these daisies to stand out later, the light against dark. And I'm tilting that now to hopefully create some nice effects at the edges of that dark there to look like little sort of blades of grass, or sort of soft blades of grass there. So when you tilt, don't just tilt for a couple of seconds, tilt for a little while, and you'll get some really nice effects, and the paint will move as well. So I'm using some Brusho now. You don't have to use Brusho. You could actually spatter some darker green paints wet on dry later. So those of you that like Brusho, you can sprinkle this very gently. A little tap goes a long way, and do practice this beforehand. But it creates some lovely dark textures. You can see I'm tapping at the base there just to get the Brusho to be released. I've actually sort of use a push pin to make a little hole in the lid at the top of the Brusho there. So it's such a small hole, and that's all you need to release the Brusho. And I'm also using some salt there and sprinkling it onto the damp surface, so make sure it's not too wet and it hasn't dried too much. And the salt will absorb the paint to create some lovely light textures. And you can see where I've got a hard edge here, so I'm just softening that hard edge again with a clean damp brush. The main reason I'm doing this is when I paint the barn, I don't want to paint up to a hard edge. It'll look very awkward and flat looking. This way you can sort of layer over things and it creates depth in the painting. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. And as you can see here, the salts work really well. It's created lots of texture, but it's also created light, especially in the sort of top middle area of the painting where the light's coming through the trees. For this next step, I'm going to paint a light wash on the barn, and then I'm going to build up the foliage on the trees using sponging techniques and stippling. And then I'm going to paint the tree trunks and branches in. So I am mixing up now some colours for the barn using quinacridone gold. I'm also going to use some yellow ochre. If you don't have quinacridone gold, don't worry. It's just to make some lovely sort of natural, earthy sort of looking colours. I've actually mixed them both together here, and I'm painting wet on dry with my size 8 brush. If you haven't used masking fluid, you can just paint up to the edge of the roof line there, and you can use a paper towel to lift off any paint to create some light areas as well on the front of the barn. I'm mixing up here some phthalo blue, a pinch of the quinacridone gold, and also a pinch of burnt sienna, just to kind of make a really sort of earthy green colour. And I'm just painting that wet into wet there with my size 8 brush, just sort of blending as well here and there. It's very dilute, and it's just to sort of paint the underpainting of the barn. And I'm just again lifting off there with the paper towel. And that's lovely actually. You always have your paper towel on standby so you can sort of change things. And I'm painting a little bit of dilute burnt sienna here and there, wet into wet, still using that size 8 brush, and sort of almost printing with the brush to create the sort of almost texture with those sort of wood planks that are going down the sort of front of the barn there. And I'm just adding a little bit of dark here using phthalo blue and burnt sienna just around the edge of the barn, wet on dry using my size 8 brush. I'm also almost using the Brusho as a guide, but if you don't have the Brusho there and you haven't used it, or it hasn't gone in that particular space, don't worry about it. But I'm just sort of diluting as well. And the main purpose of this is to create a dark against light, so that the barn really sort of comes forward just here and there. You don't want to outline it all the way around, but it'll look like, because it'll look like a cutout. But this way it'll look more natural. So I'm doing the same on the right hand side, using that phthalo blue with the burnt sienna and just painting these darks. Now it is like this in the photograph, which is great, but if it isn't sometimes, you're kind of using some artistic license to bring out your focal point using dark tonal values. So I'm just stippling as well with my brush to create the texture of the foliage as well, using some more burnt sienna, quinacridone gold and the phthalo blue, and just painting wet on dry here just above the roof line, and loading my brush again, adding a pinch of ultramarine there just to make the paint darker, using the tip of my brush to stipple to create the look and texture of foliage. So you're very much in control here, painting wet on dry, stippling, and I'm just softening some of the hard edges there using a very dilute wash there, literally water straight from my pot, and again stippling and having fun with it. And I'm trying to really bear in mind I don't want to lose the light that's directly above this. It's really important to kind of keep that. So working my way here and then spattering some of that very dilute green there, stop myself from drifting too far above there. So I'm going to paint the trees now to the right, the tree trunks. So I've used some phthalo blue with burnt sienna. I'm actually going over this Brusho here as well, where it's very dark. And I am just painting wet on dry here. I've added some Paynes grey to make it even darker. And I've turned my painting to the side so I can paint this tree trunk here. I just find it's easier when you're painting sort of long, thin objects, etc. Just painting the branches there, and I'm carrying on painting some dark foliage using the phthalo blue and burnt sienna with a touch of the Paynes grey, working my way down here to the wet area where I painted the darks just next to the right of the barn. And I'm actually using water to dilute as well, so I'm really sort of varying the tonal values there and stippling with my brush, adding a little bit more phthalo blue with quinacridone gold and stippling here to the right hand side. You can use a sponge to create the textures as well. So adding a touch more burnt sienna with the phthalo blue and painting this bush here just to the front of the barn here, wet on dry, again stippling with my brush to create texture. And again, you can vary the colours, so you might want to add a little bit more burnt sienna, quinacridone gold, or add a touch more of the phthalo blue, so you get these sort of variety of dark greens. And it is very dark here, and it's to really bring out the light of the barn, and that's our focal point, so it really sort of makes it shine by sort of framing it almost in this dark colour. I'm using a scourer here. You can use a natural sponge, and I'm sponging on the darks there, wet on dry, and I'm using my spritzer bottle just to soften some of the textures here, and it allows me also to sponge wet into wet. So I've mixed up a lighter sort of mid-green there using yellow and phthalo blue. It's quite a creamy mixture, and I would recommend that when you're sponging. And I'm just sponging this now, damp into damp, onto the watercolour paper with this mid-green. So I've used a little bit of burnt sienna and Paynes grey. I'm painting with my size 4 brush, and I'm painting some tree trunks and branches where the paper is dry and where I haven't sponged, and just sort of painting sort of smaller branches, etc. As you can see, just sort of building up the details here. You don't have to paint every tree trunk and branch, of course, but it's just quite nice. It gives structure to the foliage here. So I'm just sort of painting some more tree trunks to the left. Some areas are a little bit wet where I sprayed previously, and it's still quite wet there. If it's too wet, just wait for it to dry off a little bit and then paint your tree trunks and branches. And you can add a little bit of water to that colour as well to make it paler, so that when you paint those tree trunks and branches, they will look like they're more in the distance because of the lighter tonal value. And I'm just spattering some yellow mixed with a pinch of that green there, just around that sort of middle section, just below that light area. And I'm doing the same sort of in front of the barn and to the right and left to create some lovely wild flowers of yellow, but also to create some lighter foliage. This is all pretty much wet into wet in some areas, as you can see, and it's very messy, so you might want to protect your surrounding areas. And I'm just painting using my size 4 round brush some thinner tree trunks and branches right in the distance where the light is. Now this is actually quite a light green colour, so it's a little bit of the quinacridone gold with the ultramarine watered down, so it creates lighter trees. They look much further away, but it's quite a nice contrast with the light area. You notice I've turned my painting to the side as well to make it easier for me to paint these, and you might find that helpful as well, or even turn your painting upside down. And do take your time. If you notice the foliage just above the rooftop there and at the bottom of those trees is wet, so that the trees are sort of melting into that, so they look further away as well. So it's lovely, these lighter tonal values really does create depth in the painting. I'm just adding a few more tree trunks and branches here and there to the right hand side as well, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. What I'm going to do now for this stage is I'm going to paint the daisies and grasses, the foreground grasses in. Then I'm going to paint the barn using a wax resist technique. Don't worry if you don't have any wax or don't want to use it. You can also use a dry brush technique as well. And I'm going to build up the colours on there. I have removed the masking fluid just from the daisies, and I'm going to paint the daisies. I'm using a little bit of red and yellow mixed together here. I'm going to paint the centre of the daisies with my size 4 brush, painting wet on dry, just little semicircles, keeping it really, really simple. And it adds a little bit of warmth as well to the foreground area, really sort of livening up the painting. And I'm just adding a touch of quinacridone gold to the left hand side just to create a little bit of shadow here, a little bit of detail. And I'm still using my size 4 brush, painting damp into wet there just to build up the details. And I'm adding a very light green wash now, using my size 4 brush to paint into some lighter green grasses, using yellow with a little bit of cobalt teal, but you could use cerulean or even the phthalo blue. And I'm just painting these wet on dry here and there in the foreground. The grasses get smaller as they go towards the little barn. And I'm just mixing up a more mid-tone here, so using a little bit of burnt sienna, phthalo blue and a touch of the yellow, and I'm painting this mid-green wet on dry in the foreground area. And I've added a touch of the Paynes grey as well, just to darken up some of the grasses. I'm mixing up here some permanent rose and ultramarine, and I'm just painting some shadows around the sort of bottom half of the centres there, just to create some depth. There'll be a little bit of shadow there just at the bottom. And I'm now mixing up a little bit of cobalt blue, but you can use ultramarine, very, very dilute. And I'm just painting this very pale sort of blue colour on the petals there, just a couple of petals, just to create some shadows on them as well. But I'm going to keep most of them white. I really want them to come forward. And I'm just adding a touch of a yellow highlight sort of in the centre, towards the top of the centre of the daisies there, just to add a bit of light and details. I'm using a wax crayon. You can use candle wax, and you don't need to do this either. You could actually use a dry brush technique, but it's actually to resist the next layer of paint. So I'm just rubbing this on to the barn, and it's to create texture and to make the wood look really old and the paint look like it's peeling off almost. And it's quite a nice technique. You might want to practice this technique before you use it in your painting. So I'm mixing up some cadmium red and a little bit of the permanent rose. You can use alizarin crimson. And I'm using a little bit of a dry brush technique as well, but as you can see here, the wax is really resisting the paint. So I've just added a little bit of ultramarine there as well to paint under the eaves there to create a bit of shadow. So some of the darker areas I've added a touch of ultramarine to that colour there, but still using the red and having the wax resist the paint there really creates that lovely old look of the wood on the barn there. Now, to create a dry brush technique, if you are not using the wax, is just use the belly of the brush, that's the middle of the brush, and take off the excess paint on your paper towel and sort of just scrub the brush on the side, and less paint comes off the brush and it resists it. Especially if you're using rough paper, you'll get that lovely textured effect. But I quite like using the wax as well, and you can use a combination of them both. So I'm continuing on painting the doors here, scrubbing, but also the paint's being resisted by the wax. And I'm sort of going down vertically where the planks of wood have been applied on the doors vertically, but there are horizontal pieces of wood at the side as well. So you can sort of vary your brush strokes, either painting horizontally or vertically. And I'm still using that size 4 brush and just building up as well, working damp into damp, just to deepen some of those red colours. As you can see in the photograph, some of it's a little bit faded, some of it's a little bit stronger. So you can just gradually build up. And if you use a little bit too much paint, as I did there, you can lift off with your paper towel. Some of the wood on the side of the barn is a little bit more brown. It's not been painted, or it's been repaired here. So there's kind of different wood. So I'm just adding a little bit of burnt sienna and a little bit of quinacridone gold to the sides. So I'm building up a little bit of dark now. So I'm using Paynes grey with a mixture of burnt sienna as well. And I'm painting damp into damp. You can wait for your painting to dry and work on wet on dry if you want to. But I was creating some sort of soft edges here and painting around the outside edge, the roof edge as well. And just building up the darks of the window at the top, using that ultramarine and blending with a clean damp brush, adding a little bit more of the ultramarine now, damp into damp, and I'm going to add it to this doorway here on the left with the ultramarine, darkening up that doorway and just sort of adding a touch more ultramarine. I felt it was a little bit too dark, so I've actually just painted some red there. Again, it was too much, so I'm sort of really messing around with this door here, trying to get the tonal value and colour right. So I've added a touch more of the ultramarine. The tonal value looks better now, it's not too dark, and just applying a little bit more paint there, adding some water, blending and softening as I go there with my size 4 round brush. I don't want anything to come forward too much at this stage. I just want it all to look a sort of light to mid-tones with lots of yummy textures. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. So I am going to add more darks and details to the barn, wet on dry. I'm going to paint in some more trees to the left and to the centre just to build up a little bit more details. I felt it needed it. And I'm going to finish off with a spatter of yellow paint and some white paint to add some light and details. So I've removed the masking fluid from the roof area of the barn and the front of the barn. I'm using a clean damp brush just to soften some of the hard edges left by the masking fluid. Because you kind of wake up the paint, because watercolour is not permanent, that sort of light colour has actually sort of enabled me to create a little bit of shadow here as well. And I'm gone back to my size 4 brush here, and I'm just softening some areas here, creating a little bit of detail as well, using now the Paynes grey mixed with the burnt sienna, and just painting a little bit of dark there just to define some of the darks and details there. Below the sort of roof edge, this window area here, just to really sort of straighten it up and sharpen up those details, wet on dry. And just going around and sort of bringing to life some of the gaps between the planks as well. just decided to add a few more trees using the Paynes Grey and Burnt Sienna mix, wet on dry, using my size 6 round brush. It's just to build a little bit of the detail here to the left hand side. If you notice, I have turned my painting to the side. I just find it so much easier to paint sort of long thin objects horizontally like this, or vertically. It just makes it easier to see things, but I do tend to turn it back the right way or upside down, just to kind of see things in a much more visual way and not just as a representation of the subject or the landscape, but just to see it as lines and marks and angles, colours, lights and darks, etc. I like to sort of see things balanced, almost looking at things just in a very abstract way. So I'm adding some details of tree trunks and branches, going through the centre here. Not too much detail, but just sort of sharpening up some of those details. I've decided to spatter some yellow paint with a pinch of blue here and there, using my size 6 brush, just to add some light and texture to the left behind the old barn there as well. I just quite like doing it, and also it stops me from overworking. You may not need to do this, it's just part of my process. And I do love the way there's so much light if you look in the photograph, and it's my way of creating that sort of light coming through the trees as well without stippling with my brush. But you could make those marks with your brush as well. I just find that spattering is more random. You may need to cover the barn with your hand and also the daisies, and maybe actually cover it with paper towel if you're worried about getting any little yellow spots on your daisies. But they almost look like wild flowers as well in front of the barn, and that's something that Karen did sort of request, some wild flowers. So I've not just got the daisies, but little wild yellow flowers as well, to really bring this painting to life. So I've decided to dry my painting to stop me from spattering, and I'm just using a little bit of white gouache. You can use white watercolour or white acrylic, and it's just to finish off my painting, adding a few lights here and there. It's really good, especially if you may lost a little bit of light, but it's also quite nice for adding texture and details as well. I've also decided to add a few more petals to my daisies, just to tidy them up a little bit as well, and to bring them to life, just using that white gouache wet on dry. So here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you again to Karen for the suggestion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Using that photograph, but also sort of transforming it and making it my own, building up those trees, working light to dark, creating that texture with sponging and spattering, and using the wax for the barn and dry brush techniques as well. And I'm also inventing those little sort of wildflowers, the yellow wildflowers, but also the daisies as well in the foreground to create depth in your painting. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to share your work, you can do so on the members private Facebook group, and a link for the group can be found in the description below. And if you want to search for any of my Patreon tutorials, just go to my website. A link for the website can be found in the description below, but it makes searching for the tutorials so much easier. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.